In this video, we're going to be talking about influence of spike protein on damaging mitochondria and how damage of mitochondria overall can lead to generic diseases. And this video is built based on the fact that recently I made a video on how you can detox from spike protein in order to protect yourself. And that in that video, we also discussed how you could protect your mitochondria. And in the scientific paper we're going to go over that we went over in that video, the authors also mention how the spike protein can cause damage in a variety of different tissues. So when we started vaccinating with the spike protein at the time, it was assumed that the spike protein is somewhat benign, and over the time it turned out that that's not actually the case. And basically, I wanted to now let you know the summary that they did on how the spike protein could be causing damage, because it was one of the best summaries I've seen. They produced this really cool figure, although with ridiculously, insanely small text. I don't know why they did that, but the figure itself is a really, really good summary. So we're gonna go over from the top right hand corner of that figure. So the very first thing is obviously spike protein, as we all know, can interact with the ACE2 receptor. That's how the spike protein can gain entry into the cells. We all know this by now, but obviously ACE2 receptor has its own functions, and as a consequence of this potential interaction between the spike protein and that receptor, it can cause problems because that receptor actually is involved in regulating blood pressure. As a consequence, this interaction can lead to thrombosis or formation of clots, but also myocarditis and pericarditis. I hope I said that right. So inflammation of the heart, and also inflammation of the variety of different kinds of inflammation of blood vessels. Moving forward, next one is spike protein has been found to be able to interact with estrogen receptors. And as a consequence, the authors claim this could potentially explain some of the menstrual irregularities that have been observed during the pandemic and post-vaccination. We did videos on that topic as well. Some argue that this might not be the reason, but the author suggested this might be the reason. However, this also reminded me, there was this paper that came out from Japan that investigated cancers after the pandemic started, and it showed that in 2021, after vaccination, cancers were on a rise in Japan. Now, that paper got retracted, so keep that in mind. That information might not be accurate. However, the cancers that they mentioned that were on the rise were those that were sensitive to either estrogen or estrogen receptor as well. So I did a video on that topic. It's available on my Patreon account, so check that out. Next one, spike protein might be binding to p53 binding protein or BRCA1, BRCA1 proteins. Now, these are tumor suppressor proteins. Therefore, this interaction could potentially inhibit tumor suppression. However, this binding has not been shown directly. It has been only shown via computer modeling. And we all know how effective computer modeling could be. We've been through this before. Remember, at the start of the pandemic, computer modeling suggested that we're all going to die unless we go into lockdowns. Well, that turned out to be a bunch of garbage. However, I can tell you that, of course, I'm exaggerating here, right? The death rate from the virus wasn't as bad as what we were really all worried about at the beginning. Not that it was not insignificant. Clearly a lot of people died from infection, but it wasn't as crazy as the modeling suggested. Nevertheless, all I can tell you is that when it comes to molecular interaction modeling, these models are fairly accurate these days. They're very powerful. Anyway, that one is only based on computer modeling. We're gonna move forward. It appears that spike protein could also be interacting with what is referred to as alpha-7 nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. I know it's like a mouthful, but basically those are the receptors in cholinergic neurons. So they use acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter. Now, personally, I did a video on this. I did a video about 4 different reasons why I'm excited about the vagus nerve, and the binding between the spike protein and this receptor was one of them. So check that out. But the basically point is that the authors were mentioning that this potential interaction could be leading to some of the neuropsychiatric symptoms that are being observed after the encounter with the spike protein. All right, next one, I believe, was the influence of spike protein on the mitochondria. And in a previous video where the spike protein detox video number 2, I mentioned that spike protein can damage mitochondria directly. It can also prevent mitophagy, which is a process that removes damaged mitochondria. And as well as spike proteins are known to aggregate and they can cause microclots. We did a very large series on that topic as well, so please check that out. Very visually stunning information how scientists were showing this. But the take-home message is that clots obviously would lead to hypoxia, not enough oxygen, and that would also damage mitochondria. The basic outcome here would be that mitochondria would not be producing enough energy. You would also end up experiencing having more reactive oxygen species released by mitochondria, and that can also be dangerous and damaging. And the outcomes would be stuff like experiencing fatigue or exercise intolerance, the stuff we see with long COVID and post-vaccination syndrome. Moving forward, the next one they focus on was blood-brain barrier. What is that? Basically, the blood vessels that go inside your brain are very tightly regulated as to what can exit from the blood into the brain. This exchange between blood and tissues is not as tightly regulated in other areas of the body, but in brain, it's very, very carefully regulated, and that's referred to as blood-brain barrier. And the spike protein appears to be reducing that blood-brain barrier effectiveness, and potentially spike protein could be entering the brain that way. And this, the authors claim, might explain some of those neurological symptoms we're seeing as well because of the spike protein. Moving forward, this next one will be interaction of the spike protein with some of the pattern recognition receptors. Now, what are those? Pattern recognition receptors are these receptors that recognize foreign molecules or damaged stuff inside your body. It's part of your innate immune system, meaning this immune system that is always present, always on. And specifically, spike protein could be interacting with toll-like receptors. We did a video on that as well, one of the earlier videos, so please check that out. And the outcome of that could be overstimulation of these innate immune system receptors, resulting in too much cytokine release and inflammation. All right, moving forward is that spike protein could be contributed to misfolded protein aggregation and interact with other misfolded proteins, such as, say, prions. Again, we also covered that in a previous video as well. And probably the most famous example of that is the spike protein influence in those microclot formations because of the fact that spike protein appears to be binding to these elements, protein elements called amyloid beta segments. And basically, those are the type of elements that can lead to misfolded proteins that could aggregate. And spike protein could be involved in that. And microclots is probably the most famous element of that. And another potential component, when you think of prions or misfolded proteins, you also can think of neurodegeneration. All right, so then next one, we're almost done, is spike protein is also known to interact and bind to CD147 protein. This is another one that is found on, it's a transmembrane protein, so it's found on the surface of the cell. And this is another way that the spike protein can gain access or entry into our cells, besides ACE2 receptor. At the start of the pandemic, this was not known. So as a consequence, because of this binding, it can inhibit this protein, CD147. But this protein has a lot of important roles. It is actually also involved even in cancer progression, but it also can regulate some of the immune system functions. angiogenesis. It has a lot of functions. The point here is that the outcomes the author claims could be again inflammation of the heart and some of the vasculature diseases as well. And the last one is spike protein itself could be mimicking some of our own proteins. So basically mimicry of our own proteins. And as a consequence of that, it could lead to some of the autoimmune conditions. And we did a big video on autoantibodies and how autoantibodies could then lead to some of the long COVID symptoms. And one of the best studied examples for myself of this molecular mimicry, where I did a big video on this, is that there is a fragment of spike protein that completely mimics part of galectin-3 protein. And galectin-3 protein is also a big one, involved in many different functions, but it can also be involved in cancer development as well when it's not properly regulated. So you can see there's a myriad of potential problems with that spike protein could be causing, which we did not know at the very beginning of the pandemic. We're hoping that it's more benign than that, but as the studies went on, we discovered all these possible problems. So, but now let's reverse back to mitochondria and focus on that. How specifically, why mitochondria? Well, there is another recent paper that summarized how mitochondria could be affected because of say COVID-19. So these authors specifically focus on COVID-19, and they mentioned that those who had COVID-19, up to 70% of such individuals, which is basically a huge portion of all of the public, because almost everyone got infected by now, could show reduced function of organs. And this is primarily expected to be due to dysfunctional mitochondria. Now, why that is an issue is because reduced function of organs eventually can lead to serious diseases. Now, when it comes to reduced function of mitochondria, this has been well established with autopsies of COVID-19 victims. So to give you an example, autopsies of hearts showed that the genes that are supposed to make sure that that mitochondria are working fine. These are suppressed in heart tissues of COVID-19 victims. Both, whether those are genes from the nucleus or genes from the mitochondria genetic information itself. Remember, mitochondria has its own genetic information. It has its own DNA as well to produce some of its own proteins. So it's the only organelle in our body that has its own DNA and function like that. Everything else is determined by the DNA inside your nucleus. And as a consequence, those hearts from autopsies of such individuals also showed activated glycolysis. And that's a different way of producing energy in your body than what you would normally expect, which is oxidative phosphorylation that mitochondria participates in, which is producing a lot of energy molecules called ATPs. So, and we've discussed both of these increase or activation of glycolysis and reduce oxidative phosphorylation. We discussed this in the concept of cancers being a potentially metabolic disease where mitochondria are indeed not properly functioning. So please check that out. We did a series explaining all of this and what that means in terms of potentially how we should be looking at cancers and how they potentially should be treated. So check that out for the background information. By looking at other tissues, for example, kidneys, autopsies of COVID-19 victims showed that kidneys have also reduced oxidative phosphorylation, the type of metabolic processes that we want because they produce a lot of energy. And then whether you look at heart, kidneys, liver, lungs, when you look at these tissues from the cadavers of COVID-19, people who die from COVID-19, the morphology of mitochondria always appears to be affected. So And this continues basically post the acute phase of COVID-19, so it persists. Now, one more thing that I'll mention. So, for example, long COVID, right? We all know about the long COVID people, and it appears that mitochondria is also affected in such individuals. So, to give you an example, when you take the blood from long COVID people and isolate immune cells from the circulating in the blood, then these immune cells have also impaired oxidative phosphorylation. Or if you take a muscle biopsy, these muscle biopsies from long COVID people also show that the morphology or structure of the mitochondria is not normal and their function is not normal. And that might make sense because a lot of the symptoms of people with long COVID is very similar to people who have mitochondrial conditions, diseases. All right. So now, then let's link back this. So why mitochondria? And a lot of you might not know, but mitochondria itself can influence inflammation and induce inflammation. And it's specifically via its mitochondrial DNA. So inflammation itself can also lead to damage of mitochondria. So for example, two major pro-inflammatory cytokines, which is interleukin-1 beta, I believe, and TNF alpha, tumor necrosis factor alpha. These cytokines, which are basically molecules released by our immune cells, that these two can induce inflammation, which is really important. Of course, inflammation is to fight infections and protect us, but it can also damage tissues. And those two, for example, are known to affect mitochondrial DNA. And why is that important? Is because mitochondria, via its mitochondrial DNA, can activate innate immune system and increase inflammation. So how does that work? So as a consequence, because of that, if mitochondria activates inflammation too much, it can cause tissue damage. And if it causes tissue damage, of course, you can lead to diseases. And how does this work? The paper explained this really neatly. In essence, when, remember I mentioned these pattern uh, pattern recognition receptors that we have all over our body that are supposed to recognize either something that is damaged in our body or pathogen patterns, then as a consequence, some of these pattern recognition receptors can recognize mitochondrial DNA. So when a mitochondria is damaged and releases DNA into the inside the cell, there are these receptors that can recognize and interact with that mitochondrial DNA, and they become activated. And once they become activated, they create this chemical. And it's not important, but they create this chemical, which itself will then activate another protein called STING, like bee sting. And the STING stands for stimulator of interferon genes, I believe. And basically, when this happens, this protein can then go through its own process that down the road, eventually what it does, it leads to activation of, I believe it's called interferon response factor 3. And that is then protein. That protein itself can go then enter the nucleus and activate genes that will produce interferon. Now, type 1 interferons. Now, what are these type 1 interferons? These are the molecules that induce inflammation, and they, number one, they warn other cells around, hey, listen, we're under attack, so be ready. And then this helps these cells to make sure they're not as easily infected by virus. Number two, they communicate with immune cells, such as, say, natural killer cells, to start killing already infected cells. And then they can regulate inflammation itself to make sure that tissues are not damaged. But if you have too much of this, or if you have a chronic problem, then you can appreciate how this could lead to a disease. And therefore, this could be underappreciated problem, where if you have chronically damaged mitochondria that are not properly working, then you could also have chronic inflammation that could lead to tissue damage and eventually diseases. And we talked about that in one of the videos that I that was dedicated to the concept of how mitochondria are internal molecular processes of information. Check that out. We also talked about that there's now emerging theories suggesting that many of our major diseases, such as cardiovascular diseases, cancers, neurological diseases, lung conditions, stem from the fact that mitochondria are not working properly in these tissues. And perhaps medicine should start looking at these disorders from the concept of the fact that these are metabolic disorders, and therefore potentially we should be looking at additional ways of treating them. So check that out. I thought I would give you this, wrap it up as to why we're how mitochondria could be contributing to some of the conditions that we're seeing, not only post COVID-19, but in general as well. All right, that's I have for you today. I'll wrap it up right here. Please like the video, please share, please subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye, everyone.